welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I am Shana Batterson, a writer with a Substack page called The Red Letter. As usual, with me today is my co-host, Max Perry. Hi, Max.
Hello, everyone. Glad
Max
to
is,
be here for another episode.
Max is an independent journalist, and his work is currently syndicated with Covert Action magazine, so you can read that there. Today, we're going to attempt to tackle a few complex topics, namely eugenics, the antagonism of Marx and Malthus, current antinatalist political movements, and the green-brown connection. To start, there have been eugenicists all across the political spectrum. For a time, they viewed it as a science, but it's really a pseudoscience, was just very much in vogue. I think the nail in the coffin of its reputation sort of came with the Nazis, but it's been rebranded and is still around, obviously. But
Yeah.
anyhow, the Fabian Society, a lot of them were eugenicists. And today you see people saying that the Fabian Society are Marxists, but that's not actually true. And I think that Marx would have characterized them as bourgeois socialists. I mean, Lenin wrote some things pretty critical of the Fabian Society, as actually did Trotsky. Do you want to talk about the Fabian Society at all?
Yeah. I think that these ideas, related to eugenics and Malthus's ideas about overpopulation, percolated uh across the political spectrum. And I think a lot of it also has to do with industrialization, but it took many shapes and forms, as far as like where these ideas were disseminated. And so in the case of the Fabian Society, it was something that was purporting to promote. It was an organization founded in the late 1880s in the United Kingdom, to promote democratic socialism in Britain. And it really was instrumental in the formation of the UK Labour Party. And the Fabian Society actually exists still today. It basically functions as a think tank that produces policy proposals related to the Labour Party agenda. But its name comes from this Roman general and statesman whose name was Quintus Fabius Maximus Varicosius. He had a couple of nicknames. I think one was the Delayer. He was also known as the Cunctator, if I'm saying that correctly. And so basically, the name Fabian Society, this Roman general, he won wars through protracted, long-term attrition warfare and struggle. I mean, I guess he was involved in wars between the Roman Empire and Carthage, which was an ancient city-state in North Africa. And basically, those wars were won by slowly wearing the enemy down through attrition warfare instead of pitched battles. So the idea behind choosing that name was really about cautioning against too radical of approach to social change, and for the purposes of symbolizing a gradualist reformist approach to socialism through steady progress, and against the immediacy of a revolution. And so this is how the Fabian Society distinguished themselves from more radical socialist groups, and because they believe in working within the existing political structure and implementing social change through gradual reforms, not overthrowing it with revolutionary action. And in the beginning, they sought to influence the conservative and liberal parties, and a lot of their ideas became central to what later became the British Labour Party and its platform, having a national health service and social welfare programs and so forth that were later adopted. The precursor to the Labour Party was called the Labour Representation Committee, and the Fabian Society played a key role in its formation. and developing the public ownership policies and platform that became that of the UK Labour Party. And their compilation of essays, the Fabian essays, had an influence on both the public at large and disseminating, what they considered socialist ideas in Britain, but it also were disseminated through the political elite. And a lot of famous British intellectuals were part of the Fabian Society, like George Bernard Shaw. And another famous figure that was part of the Fabian Society was also the author H.G. Wells, um, who was not only the author of fictional works like The Time Machine, but he was also a political theorist. And later on, actually conducted an interesting interview with Stalin, by the way, but that's a discussion for another time. But he identified as a socialist and was part of the Fabian Society, which, despite being purportedly socialist, unfortunately, it was a very elitist form of socialism. And like I said earlier, they were anti-revolutionary reformists, and they were really opposed to Marxism, really, even though they called themselves socialists. I mean, they wanted to have a government-controlled economy, state control over the economy to an extent, but they wanted to implement reforms to capitalism gradually. And unfortunately, like many in the Fabian Society, H.G. Wells was a Malthusian, was a prominent supporter of this theory of overpopulation, that there were too many people in the world and that it was necessary to drive down the population. And in his later years, H.G. Wells actually later stopped writing science fiction altogether, and he published some nonfiction political writing, including a book called The New World Order. And I haven't read the whole thing. I started to read it, but he basically advocates for, a socialistic and scientifically planned cosmopolitan world government on the basis of defending human rights. And apparently, that book actually had an influence on the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was written it was the New World Order. It was written at the outset of World War II. So I think that's kind of the beginning of where you can see this trope on the right of like there being like a socialist world government that actually has some kernels of truth to it, and that elitist socialists like Wells argued for this. But they're politically confused. I mean, it's not the Bolsheviks or Lenin that called for this kind of stuff, but it was people in something like the Fabian Society and people like H.G. Wells, who was actually very critical of the Soviet Union, despite conducting that interview with Stalin, where he seemed to be like saying he was an honest figure or whatever. But it's an interesting interview to read. But he,
Well, I think in the interview, I think Stalin says something, and H.G. Wells is like, "I don't agree with you," and that happened a few times.
yeah, yeah, that's I mean, he was very critical of the Soviet model in terms of its suppression of individual freedoms and liberties. And really, elitist socialists like Wells, I mean, it really only seemed to support socialism in that he thought it, like members of the elite, he thought it was a necessary compromise that needed to be made, that something like socialism was inevitable. And it was a form of socialism, really like what they have in Britain, with under the Labour Party in terms of, preserving the status quo. They have a national health service and social welfare programs, but it's still, there's a ruling class that maintains its power. And, the economy is organized only to the point where there won't be the kind of unrest that will lead workers to want to revolt. And you can see why this same sort of anti-revolutionary mentality would lead one to think that to ideas like that there are too many people in the world, and this idea that the herd needs to be thinned or culled. This desire to control the masses and drive the population down, because if we don't, it's going to lead to revolution, basically. And I think I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on H.G. Wells, but I think even if you look at his fictional writing, you can see these kind of ideas reflected, like in something like
Yeah,
Time Machine, you can see traces of Malthusianism, because in the book, the main character invents his time machine. I mean, it's based on Wells. It's supposed to be him. He goes forward in time after he invents a time machine. He goes thousands of years into the future. I think it's supposed to be like 800,000 years or something. And this dystopian future, there's only two species the human race has evolved from, uh, which, he was purportedly a socialist. You could read it in some respects as a commentary on social inequality. But if you look at the narrative of that book, the Morlocks, which are the underground dwelling cannibals, basically, and the ruling class who live on the surface, the Eloi, if I'm saying it correctly, they're basically, they've evolved into these almost childlike. I mean, in the 1960 movie, they're basically like these weird childlike midgets almost. Um, but the Morlocks underground, they have these big scary machines. They're eating the Eloi go into this sacrificial temple, where they are cannibalized by the Morlocks. I mean, the Morlocks are clearly supposed to be workers and the Eloi are supposed to be the ruling class. And it's kind of a strange narrative by a purported socialist, that the working class are the antagonists, and that the Eloi, I mean, they're clearly supposed to be a stand-in for the industrial capitalists. And you could interpret that book in various ways, but I think it's a pretty strange and pretty reactionary narrative, in many respects.
Yeah, and and there's another H.G. Wells book. This one, it's not very well known. I'll just read the back. So Graham, an 1890s radical pamphleteer who is eagerly awaiting the 20th century and all the advances it will bring, is stricken with insomnia. Finally resorting to medication, he instantly falls into a deep sleep that lasts 200 years. Upon waking in the 22nd century to a strange and nightmarish place, he slowly discovers he is master of the world, revered by an adoring populace who consider him their leader. Terrified, he escapes from his chamber seeking solace, only to realize not everyone adores him. In fact, some wish to destroy him. So basically, the character goes on to sort of lead a revolution, but at the end, the backwards Negroes get flown in, and there's like it totally has this kind of racist ending, interestingly. And I think that's why probably why it's lesser known, but that's
Well,
the
he
racism and the eugenics are very often linked.
definitely, I mean, there's a lot of overlap. And if you read his nonfiction, like that book, The New World Order, it really reflects his elitist views. Really, I mean, he basically speaks, about workers as, he has a very contemptuous view of the working class. And so I think that people who were in the Fabian Society, I mean, yes, they had, I'm sure they had people that were more genuinely socialist than others and had different wings within that group. But, if you read passages of the New World Order, he had a very colonial mindset and, a very elitist view of workers as inferior. And, he speaks very negatively of Marxism, and what he class war dogma, like as misdirecting them. And actually, I mean, that book, it was written, I believe, in like 1941 or 1940. And he totally equates the USSR with Nazi Germany, and basically expresses fear of mass movements of any kind leading to violent revolution that doesn't produce any actual social change, in his view. And I think that this kind of reflects that kind of elitist form of socialism that was popular among the elite at the time, that it was seen as something that was inevitable. So, okay, we have to make certain compromises so we don't have any actual overall systemic change that's going to happen if the masses are not controlled and inequality is not reduced, at least to some degree, because it'll inevitably lead to violent revolution. And that's the kind of person that was, prominent in the Fabian Society. And, the British elite, the aristocracy, Malthus's ideas had a noticeable impact on the British upper class. They felt threatened by the numbers of poor in terms of population growth. You know, uh, they believed that there was a surplus of people. And the Fabian Society, even though they were purportedly socialist, many of them saw even something like British imperialism as a means of spreading, enlightened governance. Like, for example, there were people in the Fabian Society that supported the Boer Wars in South Africa. The Fabians were split over that. There were some of them that did. Some of them viewed imperialism as this progressive force. Others were for decolonization. But the Fabians were an important part in the formation and development of the Labour Party, which, yes, did later on, it oversaw the dismantling of the British Empire, and it does have a left wing, but ultimately it was a bourgeois party, as Lenin said at the time. And I think that as far as British imperialism goes, the Malthusian idea of there being a surplus population is tied into why the British Empire went out and colonized the developing world. People tend to think that imperialism is just about extracting resources, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, I think I like what you're saying about the Fabian Society. I think it's kind of related. Actually, I think I can't remember. It's like the last section maybe of the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels talk about basically why they were calling themselves communists, because it was to distinguish from what they were calling the bourgeois socialists, and were basically, the bourgeois people who were espousing socialist ideas as a way to sort of protect themselves and to have a socialism within their own interests. And speaking of conflating the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, and I read a lot about this in this book here, The Pure Society from Darwin to Hitler by Andrei Pichot. But in the 20th century, the only institutionalized opposition to eugenics came from the Catholic Church and the Soviet Union within the was called like the Lysenko era under Stalin. And there were a number of communist eugenicists, although most of them advocated positive rather than negative eugenics, which means like human breeding versus forced sterilizations, although there were some that advocated forced sterilizations. The two biologists that brought the eugenics movement to the Soviet Union were Nikolai Konstantinovich Koltsov and Yuri Alexandrovich Filipchenko. Both had studied and worked in Western Europe prior to the October Revolution, because that's sort of where eugenics arose, was in the West. They established a eugenics bureau and attempted to reconcile eugenics with Marxism. But a disciple of Filipchenko advocated for a sterilization program akin to what the US had at the time, because the US had a sterilization program for, I believe, criminals or the mentally unfit, especially I think in California, but that wasn't the first state that adopted it, I don't believe. But, long before Nazi Germany. But anyhow, a disciple of Koltsov, Alexandra Sergeyevich Serebrovsky, proposed an artificial insemination program in 1929. But at that time, Stalin was coming to power, and in the 1930s, eugenics was declared a bourgeois science. The Eugenics Association, its journal, and its institute were all closed. Other scientists attempted to reintroduce eugenics into the Soviet Union, but met with little success. The eugenicist H.J. Muller wrote a book on political biology designed for socialism, meaning eugenics, and sent it with a letter to Stalin urging him to adopt a positive eugenics program, which, Stalin never ended up doing. But this drew Stalin's attention to the geneticists such as Solomon Grigorovich Levitt, who had an award from the Rockefeller Foundation, and the group gathering around him who were attempting to bring eugenics to the Soviet Union. In November 1936, Levitt was accused of championing Nazi doctrines and was arrested in January 1938. A number of the other geneticists of his school were arrested, and at this time, the theories of Lysenko were triumphed in the Soviet Union as against Western genetics, and then, hence eugenics. Lysenko may have been a bad scientist. I don't really know enough to say, but at least we can see that Stalin is not the same as Hitler in regards to eugenics. But and I mean, I know that there's a French academic, I'm not sure how to say his name, Guillaume Suing, who had a book recently translated into English that was very interesting called Communism, the Highest Stage of Ecology. And he's done other work showing how Lysenko, even though it was disastrous, how he completely discarded genetics as labeling it bourgeois science. In some ways, he laid some groundwork for the discoveries made later on by epigenetics. Um, and he also, in an article he published in a French publication called Lysenko an Imposter, he said a few things about Lysenko and the agriculture of the time, because Lysenko had this idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, meaning that you'd have a certain plant or animal, certain environment that would then, its traits would change to adapt to that environment. And then it would pass those traits down to the next generation as long as they were kept in that same environment. So I'd like to just read a few quotes from Sung's article. He said, Lysenkoist agronomists are abundantly caricatured by post-war Westerners simply because they oppose the miraculous so-called system of intensive agriculture, meaning chemical fertilizers and pesticides. While this allowed maximum profit in a minimum of time, today it is clear that it's contributed to the massive destruction of soils on a global scale, has been the source of innumerable and undeniable long-term ecological catastrophes. But this, of course, is not a hoax. Lysenko and his collaborators wished, even if the results were not immediate, to develop sustainable agriculture throughout the territory based on techniques that are now fully accepted. Planting under vegetation cover, agroforestry, pastoral balance, linked to crop rotation and the development of forest strips between cultivated fields. In general, they preferred soil fertilization by biological means rather than by chemical means within the framework of extensive agriculture and not intensive in the capitalist sense of the term. And then the other quote is, is it not indeed more than urgent when searching for an alternative to increasingly incriminated pesticides to recognize the ability of a plant to transmit hereditarily over several generations acquired resistance to specific stress or certain parasites? The irony of history is that the Western geneticists themselves, once vilified by the proletarian agronomists who are launching this profound revolution in biology, overturning all the mechanistic dogmas of formal genetics as well as of capitalist agronomy. They seek to find an alternative to an intensive agriculture that was truly dangerous and deadly, both for nature and humanity. So there's, like I said, well, he may have been, Lysenko discarded genetics too much and had a lot of sort of pseudoscientific ideas. And he was, in some ways, it seems, laid the groundwork for some other later developments that have been actually affirmed by science. Sorry, that was a bit of a digression.
Well, my understanding is that there was like some initial embrace of eugenics in the USSR as far as like the healthcare system and the scientific agenda of the state. But because it was so wrapped up in political ideology that by the end of the 20s, especially, became, something that was, being dismissed as and rightly so, as a bourgeois science. I mean, a lot of this stuff really, I don't think it really ever took off there. And as far as the West goes, I mean, what you were saying earlier about the eugenics movement, which started in the United States and appeared in the late 19th century, I think that it was, these kind of ideas were spread far and wide across the political spectrum. And I think it has to do with the fact that, it intersects with industrialization, because in the shift from, the feudal mode of production to capitalism, that was a big turning point as far as the rise of factories and mass production. And you started to see, a large industrial proletariat dwelling in the urban cities. And in reaction to that, the ruling class and this aristocracy, they started to have a disdain for population density and for the poor, what they saw as overrunning the cities. So even though industrialization, and also even though industrialization obviously brought about revolutionary technological and economic advancements, it also, came with it a lot of social problems, poverty, uh, disease, alcoholism, a number of social ills. And the ruling class and the elite wanted to address those social problems, those growing social problems with eugenics and sterilization. And that's when you saw the American Eugenics Society appear, which started arguing for the sterilization of unfit, what they call waste people and the so-called surplus population, which of course could include, the disabled, people viewed as moral degenerates, racial minorities, anyone else deemed unfit. And there were all these forced sterilization laws passed in the United States as a result of the influence of the eugenics movement. And tens of thousands of people were sterilized because of their supposed genetic inferiority as a result of that. And this precedes the Third Reich by many decades. And these laws, as well as, U.S. laws on racial segregation, were known to be a direct influence on the Nazis.
Yeah, that's a good point about industrialization. As to what you're saying there, another common thread running through the various institutes in the US and Europe devoted to the study of genetics and eugenics is that they were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. I mean, even organizations that were precursors to Nazi racial hygiene institutions had been funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And the Nazis' eugenic laws were based on laws that had been implemented in California. I mean, there was a lot of crossover between implemented in the US in general. What I meant to say is was actually a lot of crossover between Californian and German eugenicists.
Mm-hmm.
And the Rockefeller Foundation, their funding of German eugenicists fell after the Nazis came to power, but it's undeniable that they had funded the institutes that basically became the basis for the Nazi biology. The
Yeah,
first eugenic law in the United States was a sterilization law, was implemented in Indiana in Indiana in 1907. And the US had eugenic legislation in place from 1907 to 1949. I know Sweden actually had some eugenics policies later, I believe in the 80s or 90s, or at least they went into the 80s and 90s. They had some for quite a while there, actually. But in the United States, criminals, the mentally ill, and um, racial minorities were often targets of sterilization. And another thing about the Nazis is it's often sort of glossed over, but the Nazis didn't start with the Jews. They started their sterilization and extermination programs actually on the mentally ill, the disabled, and the old. And then they moved on from there.
Yeah, I think the eugenicists, the rapid changes associated with industrializations and the problems in the cities that arose, such as crime, poverty, addiction, other examples of social decay, these ideas became popular in the elite, who saw it as resulting from, bad heredity. And of course, instead of recognizing socioeconomic or environmental factors, they thought that through pseudoscientific selective breeding, that's the way they could solve these societal ills. And that's why, we were talking about the Fabian Society earlier, that it even found some support amongst so-called progressive reformers who wanted to improve society through, you know, expert control and scientific, so what they called scientific knowledge. And they envisioned using eugenics as a method of addressing social problems by going after their supposed hereditary roots, basically blaming the poor for being poor. Um, and what I meant to say about industrialization is that there was class conflict that directly stemmed from that. Um, because it was massive unemployment, there was terrible working conditions, and economic depression, and eugenics became this thing utilized by the ruling class for social control and maintaining its dominance. Um, and they sought to portray groups that they deemed to be unfit, which working class, minorities, immigrants, as a threat to social progress. And it led to all these discriminatory policies, including forced sterilization, and also anti-immigrant laws were directly tied up in this as well, because it was anybody that was deemed unfit or undesirable. And it was this idea that mental illness, criminality, addiction, even being poor itself, were it's like you had something wrong with your. It was that it stemmed from hereditary factors, and it had these ideas got a lot of elite support and backing from prominent figures, industrialists, and they, one of these people was actually Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, and there was a lot of overlap between the American Eugenics Society and the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood. There was a eugenicist named Lothrop Stoddard who was, who advocated anti-miscegenation. And Margaret Sanger even at one point spoke to the women's branch of the KKK. Obviously, like something like Planned Parenthood now, like they do, a lot of good things in terms of women's health, and it's the way that people, what the question of reproductive rights, I mean, is one thing. I mean, the Soviet Union was the first place really to grant reproductive rights for women. Margaret Sanger today, she's this feminist icon. And Planned Parenthood is one of the top providers of reproductive health care in the U.S. She was at the forefront of the fight for birth control and reproductive rights, but she also was an advocate of eugenics. And this is an ugly side of her history that people don't want to talk about. I mean, a few years ago, it really came out, and she was basically, canceled. Planned Parenthood made all public statements denouncing, and her. I think that there was at one point they were. I don't know if they ended up doing it, but they were going to remove her name from certain clinics and stuff. But she had she was an advocate of eugenics. She had a project pushing contraception and birth control, specifically in the southern United States. One of her biggest patrons was Hugh Moore, who was the founder of the Dixie Cup Company and was a major proponent of population control as well. He was involved in the same broader population control movement as Margaret Sanger, and he was her major funder and financial backer. Hugh Moore actually ran birth control ads that framed, also the population control issue in terms of overcrowding and population density as an important factor in building a consensus publicly for population control interventions. And, there's numerous choice quotes from her that are highly racist, like we don't want, I think one of them is, we don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who could straighten that out if it ever occurs to their more rebellious members. She said that in the letter. So this is what she was saying behind closed doors. I mean, her supporters would say that she was trying to protect Black American lives, and I know Martin Luther King even praised her contributions to the Black community. I think that there was a variation in the rhetoric around eugenics there was people openly advocating purity of native stock in an explicitly racist way. And then there was also this so-called altruistic form it took. An institutional cover was provided with something like Planned Parenthood, where it's disguising itself under altruistic motives. I mean, obviously, like women's reproductive rights, something that I personally support. And, like I said, the Soviet Union was the first country to have that. But, and making, you know, abortion readily available. I mean, again, there's something sinister to me about the way that, for example, about the way that Planned Parenthood, the focus is only on making access to abortion readily available everywhere, especially in poor areas, when there's neglect of changing the social conditions that motivate people most of the time anyway women to want to get an abortion in the first place, which is economically motivated. They can't afford to. So it's a separate question whether, the abortion question, whether women should have, I mean, obviously I think that women should have the right to do that, period. Full end of story. But there is something sinister to me about the way that something like Planned Parenthood, targeting the poor and racial minorities, that it's just about controlling the population rather than, and making abortion as easily accessible as possible, rather than, I mean, this is a separate question from all the whether life begins at conception and all that. Put that aside for a second. I'm talking about there's something sinister and almost genocidal about, having something like abortion readily available to the poor and racial minorities, rather than trying to help their communities out of poverty in the first place. That is such a key motivating factor in getting an abortion to begin with. You know what I mean? This is an important
Yes.
question.
Yes, I agree. And that's where I think that, you'd have to say people are, the pro-life may worry about the rise in abortions. Well, then you have to say, well, if you want less abortions, so wouldn't you want to create a society where there are the living conditions are such that less women want to have abortions, or that there's more ability for care for children? But the issue never gets framed in that
It's the same
way.
thing with social welfare programs, really, in general. I mean, it's like it does create I mean, and people on the right, when they talk about like how it creates a dependency problem and this self-perpetuating cycle. I mean, for example, most like social welfare programs, like related to things like employment, for example. This is just as an example. Like it does have, of course, we need to have those programs to help people, but it also does create a reinforcing, self-perpetuating dependency problem, because people are actually discouraged. They will lose their benefits if they start working too much. And so they become dependent and attached, and they become, it's a way of like, particularly racial minorities or people who are poor, it keeps them in a box and they're not able to break out of it. They're actually almost rewarded to some extent for not working. I mean, and you can see why this right-wing rhetoric, about, welfare queens or whatever and all that stuff. Of course, it's racist and it's not addressing the root of the problem, but there is like a aspect of it in which that is accurate, in the sense that these kinds of programs do have a damaging effect in terms of because they are in some respects deliberately designed to keep people down. And it's the same thing to me with something like having something like abortion just readily available to the poor and minorities, because there is something sinister about it, because of the absence of any state planning or greater, the state is not trying to change the conditions in which that is causing them to live in that situation to begin with. And so you can see why something like Planned Parenthood, which appears to be benevolent and altruistic, is actually does have a very sinister aspect to it. And it's not surprising when you find out someone like Margaret Sanger did have very racist views and had views about the human population that were Malthusian, and that there's a lot of overlap in this stuff. And also with the American eugenics movement, which had, as we've addressed throughout this, a very big influence on Nazi Germany and their ideology. And I think that a lot of it ties back to what I was saying earlier about industrialization and the reaction of not just the aristocracy, but the industrialists and the ruling class to a lot of the social ills that came about with industrialization, and they started to see they started fear mongering about and feeling threatened by the rate at which the poor were, reproducing, and that they needed to implement these measures of social engineering and social control to address that, and that all these social ills were because of hereditary impurity and things like that. And someone like Thomas Malthus, I mean, we should get into, because a lot of people listening, they might not necessarily know we've been using the term Malthusian, but we should talk about Malthus.
Yeah, just let me make just really quickly a quick point returning to Planned Parenthood. It's interesting to note that this man named William Vaught, I'm not sure how that's how to say it. Yeah, who was an ecologist and an ornithologist, directed Planned Parenthood at one point, and he was quite worried about population growth. And at one point, he actually remarked, quote, large-scale bacterial warfare would be an effective, if drastic, means of bringing back the Earth's forests and grasslands. So it's that's, I mean, to me, that I don't even need to comment on that.
Well, that's a great segue actually. Before we get into Malthus, like I know that William Vaught, he wrote a book called The Road to Survival, and yeah, he was openly racist and advocated sterilization, and he had a big impact actually on this guy Paul Ehrlich, who really was responsible for repurposing the environment during the New Left. Paul Ehrlich published a book. He was a Stanford professor, and he published this book called Population Bomb in 1968, which really proliferated this idea of reducing the human population in the name of environmentalism. All of Malthus's predictions about the human population, exceeding the rate of food production had obviously been proven totally untrue. And so these ideas were kind of like rebranded and repackaged in the name with the environmental twist on them. I'm writing an article on David Horowitz, who just died right now, who was an editor at Ramparts back in the 70s. And Ramparts magazine, they ran articles by Paul Ehrlich about the overpopulation issue. It was a big fad at the time, basically, in relation to the environmental movement. And he was a speaker at the first Earth Day in Philadelphia, which is interesting because, for one thing, Richard Nixon played a key role in establishing Earth Day. And he also established the Environmental Protection Agency, which a lot of people have forgotten because it's now a Republican administration that's threatening to repeal it. But, Richard Nixon did this photo op where he's planting a tree on the White House lawn with Pat Nixon, in the name of saving the environment. Meanwhile, he's carpet bombing and using Agent Orange in Vietnam. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But there was a senator named Gaylord Nelson, actually, who spearheaded this, and Nixon signed off on it. And actually, the other thing that's interesting about Earth Day one of the founders or one of the co-organizers, this guy named Ira Einhorn, who spoke at the first Earth Day as well, he went on to like murder and dismember his girlfriend, and left her body chopped up in his closet while he fled to Europe. He was finally caught and later extradited, but that's sort of the legacy of Earth Day and some of the people that spoke there. But these neo-Malthusian ideas, given this environmental themed twist on Malthus's ideas about population, they're really eugenicists. I mean, they're denying that they are, but it's really exemplified by Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, which is really a new form of scientific racism because he was inspired by William Vaught, who, or Vogt, however you say it, and who was openly racist. This idea that it was simply the sheer numbers of people alone that was causing pollution and environmental problems. And you can see this now with the climate movement, that human population growth is causing climate change. It's still rearing its ugly head. They've had to rebrand and repackage these ideas because Malthus's theory about population growth exceeding food production, was proven to be untrue. So they've repackaged these ideas in a green form. I mean, even a few years ago, there was that Michael Moore produced documentary, Planet of the Humans, which people were pissed off about for all the wrong reasons. It had a lot of, accurate criticisms in it of the climate movement as far as it being corporatized. But in my opinion, that documentary was attacked for all the wrong reasons because it also revived all these racist tropes and eugenicist ideas about useless eaters, consuming the planet's finite resources. And it's just this repackaging of these ideas about the human population for a green-friendly, Western audience. People were upset about that documentary for all the wrong reasons, in my opinion.
And it's funny because people don't think about, it's not, if it's in terms of resources and consumption, then it's not the population in a quantitative way, but in a qualitative way, meaning that, one ruling class person consumes as much as like some small poor country somewhere practically. So that's, the overpopulation becomes a way of the ruling class, saying there's too many of you human garbage. Because if there's too many of you, then I won't get to have my really opulent lifestyle.
And, there's also a lot of fear mongering about like overpopulation as far as like density, goes, which really, it really goes back to like the racial panic about overcrowding in urban cities that the elite had after industrialization. And you can see these kind of ideas today being revived with fears about overcrowding, even though it's demonstrably false. I read this article on the website Who, What, Why, or Wait, But Why, I think, talking about that gave all these like visual demonstrations of how it's false, like, that the entire US population could fit standing shoulder to shoulder into a square space of like 3.5 miles by another 3.5 miles or something like that. This idea that there's too many people, I think you can trace back to, the racial panic and the contempt for the masses that the elite had, and all the social problems that were arising in cities, in the shift from feudalism to capitalism and the change in the mode of production, and industrialization. And that's when they started also coming up with these ideas that these social problems were a result of heredity. And as far as overpopulation goes in Malthus, I mean, for people who don't know, Malthus was a British scholar, an economist. He
And
was well known for his population theory.
he was a pastor too, I believe, wasn't he?
Was he? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I feel like I remember reading that. I read in this book, Marx's Ecology by John Bellamy Foster. He talks quite a bit about Marx's clash with Malthus. And yeah, I believe that Malthus was a pastor.
Wow, I didn't know that. It's been a while. It's been over. I read that book a long time ago. It is a great book. But yeah, I mean, as far as like other thinkers of their day, I think of all of them, Marx and Engels probably detested Malthus the most. Um, Marx said that his work was apologism for the poverty of the working classes. And, Malthus basically argued this pseudo natural law that the rate at which population grows is exponential, whereas the rate of the growth of food production is linear, and that basically suggesting that at a certain point in time in the future, there's going to be this impending agricultural crisis because food production supposedly can't keep up with the rate at which the population is growing, and that the planet can't sustain indefinite population growth with the limited quantity of resources. If that sounds familiar, this is a lot of like what the climate and environmental movement is saying today, and also elitist people like Bill Gates and Jane Goodall and all these ghouls. Um, and also that, Malthus, argued that overpopulation would create poverty because an increase in the number of poor people would reduce wages for the working class. And I think that that's why some socialists, purported socialists like H.G. Wells might have thought, in their mind that overpopulation was tied to low wages or something. I mean, the idea that it's an outdated idea that poverty is caused by scarcity. It's just not true. Uh, and in
Well,
Malthus's own time, this was proven to be false because the agricultural revolution in Europe had already proven that human reproduction was not surpassing production of food. And it's been proven to be false since as well, because if you look at any chart of food production and the population rate, comparing the two in the last 2 centuries, food production has way outpaced human population. And in fact, if anything, if you look in recent decades, the human population growth rate and birth rates are decreasing, or at least they have done annually in terms of growth rate since the mid 60s, which is funny because this is when you started to see a revival of Malthus's ideas in the environmental movement. And this was after the baby boom generation, which is 1946, the post-war era to the mid 60s. There was a significant increase in birth rates in the US, and then it started to drop off where there were more people, but they were having fewer kids. So it was declining. It started to decline then, not in terms of total population, obviously, but the population rate. And
well,
Malthus, in his day, he argued for austerity. He argued for cutting aid to the poor, who he blamed as the cause of the so-called population crisis because of their excessive reproduction, and that was what was causing them to be poor. If you read his essay on the principle of population from 1798, he basically says that aiding the poor, in Britain they had the poor laws, which provided public assistance. He thought it was exacerbating population growth and that the availability of aid itself would undermine the minimum wage. He also had all kinds of weird stuff about encouraging the poor not to bathe, to pack them into tight housing and confined housing. And even he even said stuff about we need to court the return of the plague. I mean, just bizarre stuff. I mean, he
well,
advocated for austerity essentially to prevent this crisis he thought was coming that never came to be.
that's the funny thing, today there isn't hunger in the world because there's not enough food. It's because of the system of capitalism, imperialism, the way that the food is then distributed.
Hmm.
Whereas, the whole Malthusian argument, well, there's not enough food for everyone, on and on. And in regards to, the view that crime and other things were hereditary, it's interesting because today, in, you know, sort of in the medical freedom movement, terrain theory is gaining popularity, which, basically says there aren't pathogens, or at least or viruses, and or at least if there are, they are not what make you sick. What makes you sick is if your terrain is bad. But it's interesting to go back because, the terrain theorists like to really criticize Louis Pasteur, who made innovations in regards to vaccinology and germ theory.
Hmm.
But his innovations actually undermined the pseudoscience that was sort of propping up the eugenic movement at that time, because what he came up with about germs and then medicine, showed that there was environmental factors that could be changed, instead of just like these people are hereditarily defective. Because I know at that time, a lot of the eugenicists, they thought diseases like tuberculosis were just hereditary. And then too, if you come up with saying that it's, oh, your illness is caused by maybe poor sanitation or lack of medicine and pathogens, those are social causes that can be fixed. Whereas if you just say it's genetic, then you have a justification for just eliminating those people. But I think it's interesting today that that's being revived, especially in the medical freedom movement. I bet a lot of people aren't aware of the sort of origins in regards to the terrain theory was actually connected with the eugenics movement.
Yeah, you can see how a lot of this stuff is seemingly disparate, but it's connected, whether it's something like environmentalism or reproductive rights or, you know, the Nazis and the eugenics movement and something like the Fabian Society. I mean, you can see the connections between all these things that are seemingly, across the political spectrum, but there was a common thread through all of them, through various misunderstandings about things. And I think a lot of it can be traced back to Malthus. And even though his ideas were disproven, they still reverberate in arguments about overpopulation, whether it's about climate change or resource scarcity. These are neo-Malthusian ideas, whether the proponents of them are aware of it or not. And Marx and Engels bitterly opposed his ideas, which of course excuse the exploitation of and repression of the poor through this idea that they're this burden who need to be controlled, or that their needs need to be removed or reduced. And of course, according to Marx and Engels, sustainability of the world population is determined by social conditions. The carrying capacity of the planet ecologically, or the threshold of the global population, if there is such a thing, is dependent upon the socioeconomic paradigm and material conditions of a given historical moment. And we have the ability to change those conditions with human agency, not the other way around, like you see with these people at the World Economic Forum and Davos arguing about that we need to reduce our numbers through social engineering. And as far as economic systems go, the maximum number of individuals of the human species that the environment can sustain over the long term has shifted throughout history depending upon the economic mode of production. And the advent of capitalism actually caused that carrying capacity to expand significantly. And that's proven by industrialization. Like you were saying, the number of the amount of resources that are there to clothe, feed, house, take care of the world's population are several times over. But unfortunately, the existing class structure prevents that take place, and you have people living in poverty, even though there's an abundance of, or you have people who are homeless, even though there's an abundance of housing. It's just an absurd system we live in. Um,
Well, we've reached a point where things have developed to a degree that there is no material reason why anyone should be homeless and really impoverished and starving. But because of the nature of capitalism, that still is, of course, the case. And it
yeah, it's an organizational problem fundamentally.
it's funny because to me, these capitalist institutions or individual capitalists, like, or industrialists, advocating for eugenics because on the other hand, a large, it's like the, what is it, the surplus army of labor, where a large impoverished mass, will work for less wages. So I think, as with a lot of things, there's even conflicts within the ruling class itself about how they want to go about to address issues of resources and whatnot.
I mean, there's enough food to feed everyone on the planet. There's so much food that goes to waste that could feed hundreds of millions of people. But because the market economy, the market system we live in, capitalism, because it's not being bought, it just goes to waste and is discarded because it has no market use value. I mean, it's just a absurd system we live in, and you know, and actually, despite all the fear mongering about population growth by the ruling class, the global population is expected to peak and taper off by the mid-century. Um, but despite that readily available information, you still have
Mm.
people on the so-called left and in the name of environmentalism, promoting this stuff. And it's very very sinister. And actually, in relation to climate change, a few years ago, there was this environmental activist group advocating that because of this impending climate catastrophe, that women make the personal choice of abstaining from having children until the existential seriousness and threat of climate change is addressed. And this group actually, there was a number of high-profile people promoting it. One of which was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez endorsed them. And I watched an interview with the founder. She's trying to say that we're not telling people that they shouldn't have kids, but we're just talking about ourselves as members of the group making this personal choice as a way of, raising awareness about climate change. But it's absurd. It's clearly they're trying to send that message and transmit it to other people that they should join them in this, what they're calling birth strike. And actually, I wanted to play the video if I could. Let me share my screen here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember reading something about how, if you encourage people to not have children, then from an economic perspective, you don't have to, especially with, we want to see the complete neoliberalization of the government dismantling all social programs, is then you don't have to pay any social programs at all if people don't have children. And of course, that also depopulates people. So I think that the whole anti natalist child free movement is a bit sinister in a certain sense.
Absolutely. I mean, people can judge for themselves here.
Our planet is in a kind of collapse. The natural world is collapsing around us, and that's actually happening right now.
Millennials and people and Gen Z and all these folks that come after us are looking up, and we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And
Learning about wildlife around the world, and
I realized that most of it was actually just in a state of emergency.
Our planet is going to be a disaster if we don't turn the ship around. And so it's basically like there's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult. And it does lead, I think, young people to have a legitimate question. You know, is it okay to still have children?
Really important to tell the public that there are people out there that are so scared about this that they feel that they can't actually have a family.
Called a birth strike. How about this for a strike?
Okay.
These are a group of women who have partners who are married, right? Who form an organization because of climate change. They feel very strongly, do I want to bring my kid into this world? So guess what I'm going to do?
Not have one.
I'm not going to have one until the world takes climate change seriously.
I can't have a child until I am absolutely convinced that we are on a seriously different path.
It's like not good enough. Like we need a universal sense of urgency, and people are trying to like introduce watered down proposals that are frankly going to kill us.
Here I came to the decision that I couldn't bring a child into that. And I was asking around people that I know, put it a little bit out on Facebook, and realised actually quite a lot of other people are making this decision.
So aside from the ecological breakdown, we're heading into this world that none of us are equipped for.
At some point, these chronic realities do reach a breaking point. And I think for our generation, it's reached that.
This is a serious strike, this is. And one of the people said, strike. I know, and one of the people there said, I do have a partner. I would love to have children with him. So it's not people who don't want to have kids and are just using an excuse. But we're really in love, and it feels like the right thing to do.
And I totally understand why this is hard for people like my mum to understand. This is now at such a crunch time that this needs to affect every decision.
Okay, I think we get the point.
Yeah, I think it's so funny they're calling it a strike because the whole idea with workers having a strike is that they're doing something that the ruling class wouldn't want them to do to force the ruling class to grant demands. But why would the ruling class care if you're not having children? If anything, you're just serving their goals of depopulation, I guess. So it's really the opposite of a strike in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's completely absurd. And it's, even if you were to accept what they were saying, even if, I mean, the climate issue we've discussed on here before, we had a guest on early in our, I believe it was our third episode discussing that topic. No matter what your opinions are about the climate issue, how in the world is that a solution to it? And what kind of a message is that sending? I mean, it's just completely
Well, I mean,
anti-human. I mean,
it's it's one step away from the voluntary human extinction movement, which says humans are a parasite on the earth and should just be completely extinct. And
yeah, and the far right, we talked about the Nazis. These kind of views, the Nazis, by the way, had all kinds of they're, apart from the fact that the Nazis were inspired by racial segregation in the US. We know you mentioned how the American foundations for eugenics research, these American foundations funded the eugenics research in Germany. The eugenics movement began in the US and England. And the main support was the Rockefeller Foundation. It financed the research of German racial hygienists, on heredity on the basis of curing alcoholism in the 20s. But the Rockefeller Foundation played a central role in establishing and sponsoring the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes for Eugenics in Germany. But apart from their inspiration from the eugenics movement and racial segregation in the US, the Nazis also, like the aristocratic elites and the ruling class in Europe, who had the disdain I was talking about earlier about the masses dwelling in urban cities, they also idealized the pastoral and the environment. The Nazis had passed all kinds of environmental laws, like creating nature preserves, championing sustainable forestry. They enacted policies aimed at curbing air pollution. Now, I'm not saying that I'm against any of those things, but they had, there's a tie-in there between eugenics and environmentalism. And even in the far right today, you can see this reflected. Like, I wrote a few articles about the Christchurch mosque shooting, which was, in New Zealand, which was carried out by this neo-Nazi Islamophobe. And I read his manifesto, and in his manifesto, there was all kinds of eco-fascist views in it, and about ideas about human population. So lowering it in the name of the environment and racial purity and all that. So like there's a lot of overlap that people are not aware of in all these ideas that people, depending on where they land on the political spectrum, they think are not connected, but they are connected. And I'm not saying there's something bad about like some of the environmental policies that the Nazis had, but there is a thread there in terms of this idea about useless eaters and
Well, I think because the Soviet Union also had forestry practices and protected nature preserves. I think it's more that not the policy itself, obviously, because like better forestry and whatnot is a good thing. It's the perspective the Nazis had about it, which is sort of, it's all about purity and eliminating the unfit and all these other things instead of, I think it's instead of it being like having public land as like a trust for the people because it's something everyone can use or whatnot.
Well, I mean, even the reason that they made the Autobahn, was because they wanted to encourage the population to go explore the countryside and explore the country, to reconnect to nature. I mean, a lot of people aren't aware of this aspect of them. So like the eco-fascism is a thing. I mean, even someone like Ted Kaczynski, like the Unabomber, if you read his manifesto, he makes a lot of accurate statements about, certain things. But then there's an eco-fascism in his views, and there's totally, tropes, racist tropes. And, the reason that he was so upset about things related to the environment, there is a overlap there, in terms of environmental causes and very far right views about race, heredity, and things like that. It's a lot of people are not aware of that.
That's where I think it's interesting when you see a phenomena like people that are anti-civilization or really idealize like almost like a feudal serf style of peasant life, because those are things you really mostly see in wealthy developed Western countries. And I almost like this, you can only have that romanticization of a really back to nature life when you're removed from it, because you haven't experienced the tooth and claw of it to a degree, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't have said that. I mean, I don't know if Ted Kaczynski was actually racist, but he was definitely like, there was an overlap in his, his Luddite views about technology and, the solutions that he proposed, which were, they're not really that different from a lot of these other ideas about thinning the herd and culling the human population. And you see people like Bill Gates express this stuff. It's anything but, a change in the economic system. And it's certainly not reducing the lifestyles, the excessive lifestyles of the ruling class, and this stuff is getting popularized. I mean, you had that absurd Don't Look Up movie, and all these Netflix produced films, they're just really promoting this stuff. And yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff that is seemingly disparate is connected in a way.
Yeah, and just to finish up, a few final thoughts and to get a little all fusserian, I suppose. Eugenics and these other sciences, it's really not about it being a science, it's part of the dominant ideology. And I think that the whole, you know, the biological motives for eugenics weren't necessarily, I mean, they were for some cases, but not necessarily the prime motivation. The prime motivation, I think, is to, if you have that movement, you don't have to address the economic problems of capitalism because you can, place it on these other things. And two, nowadays, if you have less people or you eliminate old people, then, Social Security doesn't have to get paid out. It can get used for war. And it's to a certain extent for the ruling class, depopulation is a money saver. And I don't think,
Those programs in Canada, like these
yes,
euthanasia programs, assisted dying.
yes. So that was just sort of my final thought. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I think even something like imperialism, a lot of people think that it's just about going out and conquering other countries and stealing their resources. And of course that's part of it. But I think that, even it's even more complicated than that, because like there's a built-in problem within capitalism and an economy organized around production for profit, which is the crisis of overproduction. That, like the ruling class has this, they know that there's this built-in contradiction within capitalism of overproduction. So something like proposing lowering the human population that's what they're proposing as a solution, rather than, obviously not changing the system, having revolutionary change. They want to come up with any kind of solution that excuses, these built-in, like I was saying earlier, the absurdity of there being an excess of housing, but there's homeless people. There's hungry people, but there's too much food has been produced to the point where it's just being discarded, and there's enough food to feed everyone 8 times over or whatever it is. There's a fundamental contradiction there, and that's one of the things that actually drives imperialism, because these countries are going out and they're seeking new markets, new territories. This is why the British Empire went to India, and they burned all the looms and took over the textile industry in India. They forced them to import cloth from British manufacturers and forced them to buy their products with the conquest and seizure of India. And they had a new market to dump their excess goods on. That contradiction of overproduction within capitalism, forces imperialist countries to go out and colonize other countries. And so something like overpopulation, which became popular within the elite at that same time concurrently, that's what was being sold as a solution to the so-called excess population that within the imperial core. Also there's also the advancement of technology as far as it impacts human labor. I mean, now you've got not just they're not just saying stuff like we need to lower the human population, but now we've got machines replacing human jobs. And so it's like, well, now they really don't need us around. Now they really want to get rid of, lower the human population because they don't even need us to do the labor anymore because now they can have machines do it. But there's a contradiction there because value of commodities comes from human labor itself.
Well, that's right. I think they want to, it's like I know in, certain factories could be more automated, but for profit motives, it's better to keep it as a sweatshop than to automate it more. And I think that, that's why you're going to see the machines taking over like more high paying jobs and still having people do the heinous jobs that the machines should actually be doing, if you know what I mean, like mining or these other unpleasant things. So that's all for today, and thank you for listening. You can view us on
Yeah.
Substack at, is it Shana Batterson Substack?
Yeah, and then we have you can follow us on X. It's Captive Minds X, and then also our YouTube channel. Hit like and subscribe. It's Captive Minds Pod. Thank you for watching and listening.